All right, everyone. Aloha. My name is Shelby Morrison, and I am the Programs and Communications Coordinator at ikahi Mediation Center. Welcome to our Finding Solutions Growing Peace Brown Bag Lunch Series. Now, ikahi, in case you're unfamiliar, is a nonprofit community center serving East Hawaii. We are located in Hilo. We were founded in 1983 as a program of the Island of Hawaii's YMCA, and in 2006 became our own independent nonprofit. We empower people to come together, to talk and to listen, to explore options, and to find their own best solutions. To achieve this mission, we offer mediation, facilitation, and trainings like this one to strengthen the ability of diverse individuals and groups to resolve interpersonal conflicts and community issues. Once again, these Brown Bag Lunch series are the third Thursday of every month at 12 noon on Zoom. You just need to register on Eventbrite for each one of those series. Our next event will be August 15th. We'll put the message here and the link into the chat box. Our next brown bag will be by myself, and I'll be speaking on taking it outside, allowing nature to act as mediator. So if you're curious all on involving nature into your communication efforts, feel free to join us for that one. All right, at the end of today's talk, we'll ask you to fill out a short online survey, which helps with our grant funding for this free series. So when I put the survey link into the chat, please take a moment to give us your thoughts. We'll also send out an email later with the video link as well as the survey link. So without further ado, let me introduce our topic and our speaker. Our topic is communicating across cultures, lessons I've learned. And our speaker is Miss Elizabeth Kent, JD, who has helped people and institutions find solutions to sticky problems for over 30 years. She has practiced commercial law and worked in Hawaii state government, including the Department of Human Services, the University of Hawaii, and the Judiciary Center for Alternative Dispute Resolution. Currently, she is a facilitator and mediator and provides training in conflict resolution. All right, Miss Kent, take it away.
Well, thanks. I'm excited to be here. Hello, aloha. And I'm excited to briefly talk with you about a subject that both perplexes and intrigues me. And it's going to be brief because we have an hour to talk about this topic that we could easily spend a year talking about. So a little bit about me. I am neither a psychologist nor a sociologist, so I'm not trained in this area. And we may be fortunate to have some people in our group who can add to the conversation. Instead, I'm coming to this with the perspective of having been a mediator and a facilitator for about 3 decades. I've experienced a lot of interesting situations that involve different cultures and different communication styles. So when I find a subject that interests me, then I like to look into the literature and the academic side of it. I talk to smart colleagues, which we're very blessed to have in this field. And that helps me learn what I can do to be a better conflict resolver. And I learn from my experiences. I certainly do not crave making mistakes and being in situations that I wish I'd done better, but they provide a lot of learning for the future. And I want to share with you some of the things that I have learned over time and my approach to some of these situations. So we run into cultural and communication issues that result in conflict in all areas of our lives. They can come up at the office with colleagues, in our families, and in more formal dispute resolution processes. I hope that when you leave our session today, you'll be able to say to yourself that you're more aware of some of the aspects of culture, that you're able to assess and analyze them, and have some actions that you can take to prevent them or to intervene when they come up. So this session is going to be a lot more fun if it's an interchange and a conversation and not a monologue. And what we're going to do is start off with a poll. I'll give you a situation to consider and then a set of possible responses and ask you to pick the one that is most like what you would do in that situation. After you take the poll, then we'll briefly look at the results and I'll ask if anyone was surprised by the results and we'll come back to them in about 10 minutes. Then I'll give you some definitions of culture and briefly talk about some aspects of culture that have come up for me in my career. Next, I'll share the approach that I use, the 3 A's of awareness and assessment, analysis, and action. That's actually 4. So I put awareness and assessment together. And then we'll have time for questions, comments, and brief discussion. Next, we'll talk about the action steps that I've taken over the years, and then we'll have more time for you to briefly share your experiences and questions, comments, and discussions. So I'm a multitasker, and I suspect that some of you might be multitaskers too. We like to keep our brains busy. So if you have comments and ideas as we go along, please put them in the chat, and Julie, Shelby, and I are going to try and keep track of them so that we can make sure to address them, and other people will be able to learn from them as we go along. Also, I know that there's a lot of expertise in the room, so please share your tips and techniques in the chat so we can all learn what's worked for you. So we're going to go to the Zoom poll, and here's the situation. You and your boss often travel together for work. Each time your boss drives the rental car and has commented several times about not liking backseat drivers, driving assistants. Your flight today was delayed and long. You flew east to a city that you haven't been to before. It was dusk when you finally got the car. Your boss is following the GPS instructions and is about to turn right. You see that this is a one-way street going left. What, if anything, do you say? Shelby, would you put the poll up, please?
Absolutely.
Thank you. So question, the response, you can say nothing. You can say, I wonder if we're turning the correct way. Or I think it's better if you turn right. That sign says right turns only. Stop. This is the wrong way. Give you another 10 seconds. Okay.
We've got about 60
5, 4, 3,
submitted.
2, 1. Shelby, will you end poll and show us the results so we can see some of them? Okay. So is anybody surprised by the responses? 24% said, I wonder if we're turning the correct way. None of you said say nothing. Everybody wanted to respond. So 24%, I wonder if we're turning the correct way. 4%, I think it's better if you turn right. 56%, that sign says right turns only. And 16%, stop. This is the wrong way. So anybody surprised? This is the interactive part, by the way. Shelby, why don't you end the poll? Because I'm not getting the chat. There are results. And Shelby, I'm going to stop sharing, okay?
Okay.
Let's see. We can move that. Okay. And somehow my screen is no longer going down. There we go. So was anybody surprised by the results? Anything in the chat? Ned, your hand is raised. And you're on mute. Still muted, Ned. Need you to unmute.
Oh, sorry, I thought I was a little confused because it said he was about to turn right, and the sign said right turn only.
Oh, typo. Okay. Let's change that. Left turn. Sorry. That is confusing. Speaker error. What would you have done anyhow, Ned? If it said
One of the ones that marked, the sign says turn right, or right
so
turn
you would
only.
have said that.
Correct, I did, actually.
Okay. Anybody else? So I'm going to ask you right now to make some notes for yourself. just take a couple of minutes, a couple of seconds actually, and please put down any descriptive words and phrases that you can about the fictional boss that you envisioned in this scenario. Try to just write out a picture of that person and what that boss looked like. Can you do that, please? So I read this recently. You'll never get a second chance to make a first impression, and that struck me as so true. So you just wrote some descriptive words about the fictional boss. Now I'd like you to write some descriptive words and phrases about your first impression and assumptions about me in this session. And we'll come back to these in a bit too. So in my work, I like to combine research and data with my experience, and you'll see some of that in this presentation. There is a lot of literature about the challenge of cross-cultural communication, but not that much about how to prevent it or what to do as an intervention once you diagnosis. So that's really interesting. This is going to be our approach for today. First, we're going to look at some of the research about awareness and also assessment and analysis. And that's going to set the context for the rest of the conversation. From there, it's going to be on to action steps. And those action steps can take the form of a prevention, something that you do to keep problems from arising, or an intervention, something that you do once a problem has arisen. And spoiler alert, you probably won't walk away from today's session with the solutions to all of your problems. Some of the best presentations raise a lot of questions and considerations that you can ask yourself and the parties when you find that there might be cultural issues. That's because in this kind of work, there's no hard and true answers that apply across the board to all situations. Instead, you're going to have to figure out what's the right decision based on the facts that you're facing and what feels right to you. And one disclaimer. We tend to make broad generalizations about cultures, and of course, not all people are the same, and not all people of a particular culture are the same. So while we're talking about this in general, no stereotyping, we're all individuals. So when I think about culture, I remind myself about the difference between universal truth and personal truth. This is something that I think just about everybody agrees is just plain wrong. I encountered this situation in a public restroom about 2.5 weeks ago. And I don't think anybody should ever find themselves in that situation. I think we can agree, is wrong. However, for some reason, we cannot agree on the right way to hang toilet paper. Ann Landers received over 15,000 letters when she wrote a column about this, making it the most controversial issue in her column's history. Go figure. And sometimes I find this in my work. We see the same problem, all the people who are involved in the conflict, but we have different approaches and responses to it and different situations. Cultural issues come up when someone is not meeting the other people's expectations based on how they think that person should be communicating or resolving problems. As the neutral, when that comes up, I struggle to figure out what's going on here. Perhaps if I'm able to assess and analyze it, we can figure out some steps to get the case back on track, I tell myself. The question is culture the missing piece? Sometimes it is, sometimes it isn't. So what is culture? The Merriam-Webster dictionary defines it this way in part, and I'm paraphrasing. The customary beliefs, social forms, and material traits of a racial, religious, or social group, and the set of shared attitudes, values, and practices that characterize an institution or an organization. So culture comes into play in how and where we were raised. For example, recently I taught mediation to a wonderful group of people from Palau, and that training session was different from how I teach mediation to groups from Hawaii. That, I think, is the societal definition of culture. There are business cultures too. I've worked with groups of engineers and scientists and groups of nurses and social workers. Again, I took different approaches to the process that I used. But back to definitions. I like how my friend and colleague, Dr. Peter Adler, defines it. Culture is the way we do things around here. The challenge with culture, I think, is that many of the rules are unwritten and never spoken out loud. So you just know that someone isn't following the rules. You know that they're doing it the wrong way. Have you ever had the experience of seeing something in a totally different way once you learn something new? I love it when that happens. Professor Bruce Barnes opened my eyes when he shared information about Professor Gert Hofstede, a Dutch social psychologist who did a pioneering study of cultures across modern nations. Hofstede was employed by IBM, and he collected lots and lots of data to study cultural differences in employees at the many offices that IBM had. And then he delved deeply into that data. His work explains so many of the issues that I'd been encountering and things I'd been seeing. And for me, it was the missing puzzle piece to a lot of cases. And by the way, that's a photo of my eye. And if you have any questions about any of the photos that I've used in this presentation, please put them in the chat. Sometimes not everybody gets my quirky sense of humor. So this is what Professor Barnes shared about Professor Hofstede. And there's some of the dimensions, as Professor Hofstede calls them, of culture. Power distance is defined as the way people relate to each other on a hierarchical scale. And that's one that I run into a lot. Clients and parties look at my role differently when I'm a mediator and facilitator. Some of them are very deferential and others not at all. Although I ask people to call me Elizabeth, not everybody's comfortable with that. And I'm one man that I knew, he couldn't even call me Ms. Kent. It had to be Advocate Kent. Another one that I see often, another dimension, is termed here as individualism versus collectivism. Does the person focus on the self or on the collective or group of people? I find in my work in Hawaii that a lot of people focus on what's best for the group, not just what's best for them as an individual. Uncertainty avoidance is also one that I see a lot. Some groups of people tend to be much more risk adverse than others. And by the way, there's a lot of other dimensions that aren't on this chart. If you're interested, please go online. It's just rich. And again, a reminder, not all people in a culture are the same, no stereotypes, but in general, I think that these dimensions show some of the values that people in different groups have. And if you go to the website for Gert Hofstede, you'll see a lot of data about a lot of different nations. So let's switch gears to gender differences. That's something that I often see in my work, and it can have a big impact on the outcome of cases. And many years ago, there was a book called, I think it was called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus, and that's why I have the planets up there. In my experience, women and men tend to negotiate differently. Some data shows that men are perceived as better negotiators. Again, remember, these are generalizations. The literature seems to say that that's because men tend to be more competitive, less risk adverse, and less conflict adverse. In my experience, men also tend to set a higher anchor or starting point than women do. And the research shows that setting a high anchor and being the first person to set the anchor often brings about better results. Women aren't expected to negotiate aggressively, and when they do negotiate aggressively, it can bring a negative response. So a few months ago, I bought my first ever new car. I was negotiating for the package price, and I could tell that the salesman, he was just feeling so flummoxed. And at one point, he said to me, "I don't get what's going on here." And I think that he had pegged me as a nice old auntie, and I wasn't acting like a nice old auntie. I was negotiating hard rather than hardly negotiating. And when I told him that I teach negotiations and I really enjoy negotiation theory, then it all made sense to him. And we finally struck a deal, a good one, by the way. And that was very different from what he had initially offered. So it seems to me that sometimes I see that there's different standards in negotiation for men and women. Have you seen people respond differently to when men and women express anger? I've seen people let it slide for men, and they even see it as strategic. But when a woman does it, she might be described as hysterical, a gender term, by the way, or out of control. Have you ever heard an angry man being described as hysterical? I have not. Now let's talk about language and its impact on the way problems are resolved. And I want to use this to show a little bit about context in my context. So here's a fun example. I'm from an island culture, and I could tell from those of you who thank you for putting where you're from. I think pretty much everyone who put their geography was from Hawaii. So I think a lot of you are from a island culture too. So you would know that if you ask me if I want a cookie and you're holding a bag of cookies and I respond, no, I couldn't because you only have a couple of left, you would ask again. You would probably say, are you sure? Sure you don't want a cookie? And I'd say, yeah, I'm sure. And then you'll offer me one more time and say, I'd really like you to take a cookie. And finally, I'm going to take that oatmeal chocolate chip cookie that I wanted all along, but I'm only going to take one, even though you have more than one. But not all islands are the same. If I had a few left and I offered them to my friends who lived on Manhattan Island, they would probably say, yeah, and take the whole bag and eat all of them right away. So another example, we communicate in lots of different ways besides language. When I'm facilitating in Hawaii and writing on an easel board, I never use a red marker to just write things that people are saying. It just isn't culturally appropriate here. It conveys something. No problem if I'm using a red marker and I'm facilitating in the continental US. Different way of looking at things. Also, words don't mean the same thing in all cultures, and I usually see this with different business cultures. For instance, agency means one thing to a lawyer, that means principal and agent and contract law, and another thing completely to psychologists. It means free will to make your own decisions independently to them. A few years ago, I was working with a group of scientists and they said, let's draw a cartoon about this to help us see the problem. And I was thinking, okay, they're going to do something like Mad Magazine or Archie Comics, but what they really meant was a picture. So no wonder we have problems. Let's take one more dimension while we're talking about awareness and assessment, and before I get to action steps. Mitigated speech and mitigated language is something that I run into a lot in my practice, and I recognize it because I speak that language as well, a lot. When I use mitigated speech, I might not be conveying to people what I'm thinking if they don't think in that way. So let's talk about the results of the Zoom poll. They ranged from doing nothing to then doing nothing to a hint. Geez, I wonder if we're turning the correct way. Then a question, then a stronger hint based on facts, and finally a command. This is relevant because we're all trained by our cultures to address confrontation differently. I'm not sure that there's a right and wrong in the situation, and it's something that we might all approach in different ways as we weigh the facts and think about what's comfortable for us and what comes naturally in our way of speaking and confronting conflict and what's best in a situation. But now, let's imagine a scenario that combines mitigated speech and a power differential and two pilots who come from different cultures in terms of how they respect hierarchy, excuse me. So this is what Malcolm Gladwell wrote about in his book Outliers, and specifically in chapter 7. He looked at transcripts from different plane crashes and analyzed one in which the plane crashed because of a dangerous amount of ice on its wings. Tell me if this conversation from page 196 scares you as much as it scared me. First officer, look at how the ice is just hanging on his back there. See that? Then first officer, see all those icicles on the back there and everything? And then again, first officer, boy, this is a losing battle here on trying to de-ice those things. It gives you a false feeling of security. That's all it does. Finally, as they get clearance for takeoff, the first officer upgrades 2 notches to crew suggestion. First officer, let's check those wing tops again, since we've been sitting here a while. Captain, I think we get to go here in a minute. The last thing the first officer says to the captain, just before the plane plunges into the Potomac River, is not a hint, but a suggestion or a command. It's a simple statement of facts. And this time the captain agrees with him. First officer, Larry, we're going down, Larry. Captain, I know it. Imagine how you would want them to communicate in such a dire situation. Not the way they did, and so many souls lost. And if you read the book, you'll see that this conversation is not the only one that led to a crash that Malcolm Gladwell wrote about. It's scary. So, any brief questions, comments, discussions before we go on? I'm not seeing any hands up. So let's talk. We've talked about awareness and some about assessment and analysis. Let's talk now about action steps. So we have this shared context. What do you do if you have a woman and a man from totally different societal and work cultures who've come to you for help in resolving a problem? I think of the responses, possible responses on a spectrum from prevention to intervention. And for me, it all comes back to mediation fundamentals. This is based on Dr. Albert Mehrabian's work, and the different diagrams represent the words we say, the way we say them, and body language. Anybody know which one is body language? What color?
Yellow.
Very good. How about the words that we say? Oh, I think you're muted. Can you say it again, Virginia?
The other colors are both purple to me, so I can't tell you.
Red.
Right. Red is the words that we say, and the purple is the way that we say them. And for me, it really all comes back to this. The first place to start when you know that you're having a problem is to try focusing on the whole message, especially the delivery and the content. And I'm always asking myself and stressing it to myself when I'm dealing with people from different cultures. The question is the language, that maroon part, saying one thing and the body language saying a complete other one? And which do I really need to rely on? And so I need to talk to them about that. Also, learning and knowing the distinction between positions and interests was one of the biggest takeaways for me from my first mediation training. It's very foundational and especially important when there are cultural differences. So when you're talking to people, using communication skills, especially rephrasing and summarizing and trying to find out about their underlying interests, is really critical, and that might help you prevent some of the problems that can come up later. Earlier, we talked about personal truths and universal truths. The challenge is that we think that our personal truths are universal truths. And in my preparation stage and throughout my work, I try to be aware that the way that I see the world might not be the way that they see the world, and I want to see it the way that they do. So there's lots of questions to ask and things to figure out. I mean, some of them are logistical. Here's a few. How do you perceive time? I'm a start on time, end on time kind of guy, but that's not how a lot of my clients are. And they don't mind waiting 15 minutes for somebody who didn't arrive on time. So what matters is what they think is right. I want to find out culturally what they want to do so that I don't put them in a situation where they think somebody's doing something the wrong way, and in some way in doing that, disrespecting them. How do people want to communicate? Do they do it better in writing or orally? If it's in writing, email, text. If it's orally, phone, Zoom, or in person. Each of these have an impact on how the information is conveyed and how emotion is conveyed. And more emotion can be conveyed when you actually can hear somebody and see somebody, but you might get more precision when people are writing. So what's their preference and what works for them? Also, I want to find out what persuades them. Are they persuaded more by emotions? Are they persuaded more by logic? Those are just a couple of the different dimensions, to use Dr. Hofstede's word, or different things that I want to ask about. Then I really want to know, what are their ultimate goals for the process? What does a successful outcome look like to them? Do they want to have a continuing relationship with the other people who they're having the problem with? And if so, how important is that to them? What would they be willing to give up to achieve that? As dispute resolvers, we always have to manage our biases carefully. We have to be aware of them. We don't see ourselves the way that the parties see us, and we often don't see ourselves that well too, like this picture. I try to watch the parties carefully for all the communication that they might be sharing to make sure that they don't feel judged by me or that I'm not making them feel out of place. And it doesn't always work, but all I can do is try. I do little tests in inside and outside of cases to try to figure out my own biases. So for instance, when I hear a generic name on the news, like Chris Lee, a lot of different people could fit that name. I try to associate with them. So if Chris Lee did something good, well, what did Chris Lee look like? If Chris Lee did something bad, what were Chris Lee's characteristics? And those give me insights into some of my biases. So I said I'd come back to you and ask you about the assumptions that you made about your boss and about me and expectations for this session based on your first impressions. Please take a look at them. Were they on point, or did any of them change with time? And final point, remember, it's easy to pigeonhole someone based on visible markers or cues that we see or think about, such as race and ethnicity, gender, disability, age, for instance. And we miss a lot by focusing on those and not looking at the internal differences that really distinguish people. There may be ways that you can accommodate the different cultures. Should you open with a prayer? That's not my normal way of opening, but I've done it in a number of cases when it was the right way and when it puts everybody at ease. And I found that I liked it too. It might not be necessary, or it may be necessary to meet at times that I normally wouldn't meet at, or on days when I normally wouldn't. For instance, some of my cases meet on Sunday, some meet early in the morning, that's a little bit of an ugh, and some meet late in the evening, and that's a big ugh on my part. But if that's when the parties can do it, then you got to accommodate. It's critical to make sure that we're all in the same canoe paddling forward together. From the start, I want to share responsibility for figuring out the issues and figuring out how to make it work for everybody. And the parties come up with some of the best suggestions and often raise ideas and thoughts that I never ever would have come up with on my own. So I keep asking them as we're going along, how are things doing? What can we do that's better? How can we collectively make this work? When I see a problem, then what I try to do is bring it up and share my observation, keeping judgments out, but just sharing observations. Here's an example. From what you've said, blank is a problem, but each time I try to bring it up, there's silence, and I'm not quite sure what to do with this. Where do we go from here? In addition to sharing observations, I might share data. For instance, I spoke earlier about the importance of setting an anchor in negotiation, and that men tend to generally set the anchor more often than women do. So I might share that. If I think that there's going to be a cultural difference, I'll share what I've read and observed about anchors. I'll encourage them to do their own research before committing. I might even ask if they want a break so that they have some time to think about it, read up on negotiation theory. I would do this for those of you who are mediators. I do this in a joint session, or if I was in caucuses because for some reason parties weren't able to meet jointly, then I would share the exact same information, exact same words with all of the parties. Sometimes I know that the best thing for a process is for me to partner up with somebody else. I have 3 people who are all from very different backgrounds with very different worldviews and perspectives than me, who I work with when I think that it would benefit the parties to have somebody else. And finally, I need to break it to you. We're just not going to be everybody's cup of tea. And you might find some people who you agree to work with. And as you go on, it's clear that they're not your cup of tea either. And you're not theirs. And so you can withdraw. That's somebody withdrawing from the ATM. The idea and the most important thing for me is to focus on the process and on the parties, and you got to keep your ego out of it. I just have to, it's all about them and coming up with the best thing that they can come up with for them. So we have some time. Any thoughts, questions? And I think I'll stop sharing now. This is the time to share your experience, comments, anything.
So if anybody does have a question, feel free to use the raise hand or feel free to unmute yourself and hop on. Thank you, Suzanne. Feel free to unmute yourself and ask your question.
Hi, thank you. And thank you, Elizabeth, for the presentation. I'm curious if you're in a situation where you're seeing that power differential, like an older male boss is, I don't want to say like, mowing over, say a younger female employee who's from a different culture. Like what, can you recommend some things as a bystander that you could potentially take on to help with that if you're not in a position as mediator or, but more like an informal role?
Well, first of all, I've never ever seen a situation like that. I'm joking. The so what I think a lot of the things that I said apply in that type of a situation too. I mean, a lot of those preventions and interventions. I mean, I would talk to her because I'm assuming that she's talking to you as a friend or a colleague, and I would look at what can she do to make herself as comfortable as possible in the situation. She's really gonna, so a lot of that has to do with logistics too. I mean, setting up the time and the place and the way that they're going to communicate, going back to what is going to be most comfortable for her. And so how can you do preventions to keep it from coming up and being a problem? I would talk to her about how much she's willing to share about that with the boss. I mean, if I try in a situation to start at the end of the spectrum where I'm going to share as much as possible. So I might feel comfortable with the boss saying, I'm really uncomfortable with the way this conversation is going. I would feel a lot more comfortable if we were doing it in this way or that way, and using I statements to get the message across. So I would start out with preventions. And Julie in the chat said, ask that she recommends this book, Ask for It, How Women Can Use the Power of Negotiation to Get What They Really Want. There's also a lot of really good work by Deborah Kolb and Linda Babcock. And I want to recommend a book that Linda Babcock just came out with. But let me see. It's called I want to give you the exact title. I have it right here because it is such a good book. The No Club, Putting a Stop to Women's Dead End Work by Linda Babcock and 3 other people. It's a really great read. It's an easy read and very helpful for women who are in the workplace and men too. One of my male friends read it. He's like, I need this book. So it's not just for women, but it's very helpful. Somebody said, what do I mean by set the anchor? So setting the anchor is a negotiation term. It means who is making the first offer at where you start. So let's say, oh, okay, I told you that I bought a new car recently. And so when I bought a Honda. And so when I went to Honda, they can have a sign on the new cars and it says, I'm just making this up, $40,000. That's the anchor. So then I go to negotiate and I say, I really like that new car. I'll offer you $20,000. And they say, no, no, no. And anyhow, then we have the anchors. So we have the anchor set. So when I was negotiating with the Honda salesperson, I took that tack. He started off with what he wanted to sell me the package for. And I came in way lower than that. And then you just go back and forth. I call that the negotiation dance. And we had talked, Julie and Shelby and I had talked about doing something on negotiation sometime in the future, especially focused on women. So maybe that's just enough for that and we can come back to it. But I hope I answered that question about anchors. And Porny, it's the No Club. Sorry if I blurred that a little bit. Any other questions or comments? I'm trying to look through the chat. Sorry about my mistake about the left-right turn. I previewed this with quite a few people and none of us caught it. Okay,
Oh, Elizabeth, this is Julie.
yes.
Thank you so much for sharing all those interesting bits and pieces because I like that how you presented when you talking about culture, you're not just meaning, race or ethnicity, which I think a lot of times people think of those as synonymous. Like I heard you talk about age, geographic location, gender, I mean, a lot of different things. How do you recommending, like when you're trying to expand the conversation or discuss these kind of topics with other people to have them be able to think of all those multi-dimensions and how they interact?
How? Say it one more time, Julie, please.
Like when you're bringing these issues up, whether it's like, just you're talking with somebody or you're thinking about it for your own practice or in conflict resolution, how do you help people think about the multiple layers and how they might interact?
That's a really good question. So I'd ask them how they see a situation. And then I'd ask them how they think the other person perceives the situation. And I would bring in some of the work of Professor Hofstede and some of the work of the others, not to spend a whole lot of time on it, but I think that it's useful to get people to see something from a different perspective because what we really want to do is change that perspective, have them realize that the way that they look at the world isn't the other world. So the way that everybody looks at the world. So I would keep chipping away at the way that they look at it to get them to try and see it. Remember that slide with the person holding the globe? To try and have them see it through somebody else's eyes in a different way. That's what I would do. And rephrase and summarizing, asking the right question or the right kind of question at the right time. That's one of the things. And to kind of riff off of that, Porny asked, and hi, Porny, nice to have you here. How would you communicate with an older Asian male with declined cognitive ability? Doesn't really matter to me where the person, whether they're Asian, Caucasian, whatever. I don't think that would make a difference. The thing that I focus on there, Porny, is the declined cognitive ability. And I think that the skills that we talk about as mediators and facilitators apply and that we apply to a broad spectrum of people, but there's some people that I don't think that they work with. And so for me, there's some people you don't need to use them with. I mean, those are the people who are amazing communicators on the one hand, but I really hesitate to think that rephrase and summarize and some of the other skills that we use are going to use when somebody is having diminished cognitive ability, if they don't have what we call capacity to be able to make decisions and think about things. So just like you wouldn't in the law, if you're a minor, you don't have the capacity to enter into a contract. I've had people come to sessions who are really high. They don't have capacity. I just can't ask them to enter into a contract also. And same, if somebody has declined cognitive ability, it's going to be really difficult. So I don't think that's the answer you wanted, but that's how I look at it. Somebody else on here may have a different view. Anybody else? Okay, so yes.
I'm having a current issue with our neighborhood association that seems to be divided into Hawaiian locals and condominium dwellers who were not born in the neighborhood. It's just getting to be so ugly, and I'm not quite sure how to bridge the gap. The Hawaiians are dropping out. What the condo people seem to do, and it's compounded by the history of this condominium, which all of the current local neighborhood parents objected to having being built. So they already see everybody lives in this condo as the enemy. And we're trying to generate a working group for the neighborhood, just for stuff like traffic calming and, neighborhood issues, security. And I don't know what to say. It seems like the condominium livers, of which I am one, are so they just complain so much. They don't want to like calm down out of their condo and be in the streets and do stuff together. So I don't know how to bridge that gap. I don't know if I'm the right person to do it. But it's just it's a pretty common problem in the islands, I think.
So I'm going to use that as a springboard because I anticipated that somebody was going to ask me, what's the most difficult situation for different cultures that I've ever been in? And I'm going to tell you about it, and then we're going to do a poll and then come back to it. Okay.
Okay.
So this didn't exactly happen, but it's very close to something that happened. I was facilitating a public meeting, and public meetings are very structured. This particular one was sponsored by a governmental entity. And so we had a certain amount of time, and there was a certain amount of time for the public to share their thoughts. And so I had asked how many people wanted to share their thoughts, got a show of hands, and I did the math and realized, okay, everybody has 4 minutes to share their thoughts. So everybody was keeping on track. And when I do that, I hold the mic because I don't want to let go of the mic. I want to be making sure that I have it in case somebody's going to go over and I need to control the time. So everything was going very well. And then by the way, at the time I was doing this, I was in my early 40s. Somebody got up who I would describe as kupuna age and started talking. And then the worst thing happened. At 3 minutes and 45 seconds, remember 4-minute time frame, she starts crying. And she's really crying. And I'm in this situation thinking, oh no, what do I do? There's about 10 people after her who still want to talk, but she's sobbing up there. So Shelby, could you post the poll?
Yes, here comes the second poll.
So the question is, what would you do in this situation? It was really hard for me. Here it is. Would you ask her to stop when her time is up and gently remove the mic? Would you give her a minute or two and then remove the mic? Would you wait until she stops crying and lets you know that she's done? About 10 seconds more. Okay, I'm going to end poll and share results. Can you see them? So it's really interesting. This was so difficult for me, and it's kind of like what you're talking about. For me, it was difficult because there were three different cultures. First, there's the public meeting culture. Second, which is 4 minutes, you're done. We start on time, we end on time. We stick to the agenda. But then there's, for me, the facilitator culture. I need to treat everybody fairly. And then there's the local culture. Wait a minute, she's Kapuna. I cannot take the mic away from her. And I'm thinking, I'm up there thinking, oh my gosh, what do I do? So 11% said you'd ask her to stop. And I don't know that, by the way, just like with the turn right, turn left, I don't know that there is a right answer. I don't know that there's an a right answer to this. But 11% said I'd ask her to stop. 67% said give her a minute or two, then remove the mic. 22% said wait till she stops crying and lets you know that she's done. I kind of did the second one. I gave her a little bit more time, and then she reined herself in and said, okay, I'm done. So she did go over the 4 minutes in this fictional yet somewhat true situation. And I felt like I had to, that was the thing I had to do. So going back to your question, Lee, I think I would look at doing things differently, because it doesn't, when I have groups that are from completely different cultures, so I'll answer my own question instead of giving advice on yours. I try to help them bridge the gap. And I did have a situation where people were, it was a facilitation. They looked at the world so differently based on the situations that they were in. And what we decided to do was to have a meeting where everybody came together and brought food. And there was a power differential in this group. The group that came from that had less power, you cannot believe the spread that they brought. I mean, it was almost like they got a pig and roasted the pig and brought it in. It was that incredible. And the other group brought some nice things too. But around the food, then we went around the table, and it was a big room, big table, and we asked people to say something about themselves. And I wasn't the only one that was tearing up. When people realized, a couple of the guys who, I use the word guy androgynously, so guy can be both man and woman. And when a couple of the people realized, hey, you're a vet also, or you're also a foster parent. Oh my gosh, I'm having problems with my teenagers also. Things like that. That's where you grew up. I went to that high school too. It started to bridge it. It didn't make it all better. I mean, they still had the problem that they had, but they were seeing each other as individuals. And I think that's one of the things that really helps when you want to bridge a process, is when you can see each other as somebody else. And a lot of times people say breaking bread together helps. I think that it does. So on
I
that
think that's
note,
a great suggestion, because we're currently on Zoom, and we have been since the pandemic, and it's time we came out of Zoom, I think.
I think coming out of Zoom is a really good way. It's a good way to do it. I mean, getting together, and I just wanted to show you my slide as I'm about to ride off into the sunset, because I like that picture. But going from Zoom to seeing people back in person, it all goes back to Dr. Meribian and what Dr. Meribian said. And you change the dynamic when you can actually see each other and sit down together, share some food together, and interact with each other. And I also think another good thing is to change so the place that you meet, change the way that you meet, and change the meeting structure. So Julie, I need to hand it back to you because you have just 2 minutes. So I'm gonna thank everybody and mute myself.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for that wonderful presentation. There is so much to continue to learn every time we have an interaction with someone. There's culture. There's things beneath the surfaces that we are not seeing. So thank you for shining some light onto that, Elizabeth. As a reminder, everyone, feel free to look into the chat. Your feedback greatly helps with the grant funding for this series. So if you do have time today to complete our short online survey, please go ahead and do that. It will be open until the next brown bag. So it's all right if you don't get to it today. But thank you all for coming. Please take a minute to do the survey and keep an eye on your email because we will be sending you the video link as well as the survey link just in case you don't get to that. And mahalo. And we'll see you guys next month.